the stream there.
Yeah, we'll end stream when we're done, but we'll have to
When we're done.
we'll have to close this and come back to it. So I'm going to copy this to the clipboard right here, X out of this, and we're right there where we're going to slide down. So.
Yeah, when I got
Evening, everybody. We got a huge turnout. I haven't got a chance to count how many people we got here. This is quite a few. That's awesome. Going to make this real brief so we can get into the presentation as quick as possible. Do we have any guests here tonight?
Yes, so yeah.
my son,
Oh, okay.
Lee Mulaney.
Nice to meet you. So, are you in woodworking at all, or?
A little bit from, we've got all that stuff in our garage. We'll start it out. It's your fault, huh?
None of us have that, do we?
Well, thank you. We got for the treasurer's report, since we are on camera and all that, if you want to know the amount, talk to Steve after the meeting and he'll let you know. We're gonna get away from just saying that on YouTube. Also, we're gonna do a name tag order. So if you don't have a name tag, let Steve know after the meeting and he can get your name and get a name tag for you. We try to do those in batches. So the real quick, Richard has a tool for sale, Craftsman 4x36 inch belt with a 6-inch disc, like new with the manual and everything. And you said for how much? You said $50. So talk to Richard after the meeting if you're interested in that. And then the last thing is I wanted to thank Lon. Lon donated $200 to the club to help towards the purchase of our projector, and as a thank you for everybody that pitched in to help him with his move.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody. The club helped so much. We are moved, we're all settled, we love it, and I thought the donation was appropriate because I can't even remember now who all has helped. And I thought, well, the club could probably use that toward the projector, so that's great.
And then the last thing, for next month's meeting, we'll have Ben Reynolds, Mike Bredmeyer, and Ralph, you're on the schedule, but I know you might have
I might be detained.
you might be detained, so we'll make it happen one way or another. So you've got a court you can put in there, right?
Right. Look it up in the court.
So we're going to go ahead and get into the presentation. Is there any questions before we get started? I know we're kind of rushing through the business part of it, but so I want to welcome Bob Banke. He's here from Type Bond, and please give him your attention.
So thank you everyone for inviting me. So tonight this is going to be a discussion, not me just presenting some to you. So I take questions. It's always much more, how you say, fun, a lot more exciting, less people fall asleep. So a little bit about me. I'm the technical service manager for Type On Products. What I do there is we have my business card basically is every bottle of glue that we sell. There is an 800 number on that bottle, and you will get either 2 or 3 people. So I'm the backup on phones. We just hired somebody new, so you probably will get me more often than normal. We also do competitive testing. Whenever we come up, when you guys call, have questions for us, if we can't answer them, usually we can set up a lab test, and we're going to explore it. So we'll go through some of that tonight. So I got this presentation just so that if there's no questions, I'm not standing up here just rocking on my heels. So Again, we're gonna talk a little bit about wood gluing tonight. Nothing like watching glue dry that makes for excitement. So tonight wood glues can bond a lot of different materials together. Glass, stone, leather, cloth, and all of that. So we're gonna focus mostly tonight on wood, the original composite. Beautiful, comes in many flavors, colors, designs. Oh, excuse me, Mayor, thank you. That was very nice. We should shake hands before we pleasure. All right, so we're gonna focus on wood and some of the properties that it takes for gluing to make sure that we're successful in gluing. Typically, what we'll run into is, normally the phone calls start off as your glue sucks. But to be perfectly honest, it's not rocket science to make this stuff. It is expensive, so the equipment tends to be relatively expensive, so not everybody can do it. And the other part of that is, with Type-On's quality system, I've been here with the company 11 years now, never had a problem with wood glue. So when we get the call, typically it's going to be a process error, right? And normally when the guy calls and says, I'm an engineer, I've been doing this for 70 years and have never had a problem, then my statement typically is, well, usually then you're probably not got a lot of projects going on, because I'm great at gluing, I run into problems. And so we're going to kind of go through what those problems can be, how to minimize those. We want to and appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk to you guys. This gives us an opportunity to get out in the field, talk to you guys, get you a little bit understanding of what the glue is actually doing, so you have fewer problems, we get fewer calls. I'm not so depressed with your glue sucks calls. So one of the easier things to understand about wood and wood density in terms of gluing is that the lower density of the wood, typically the weaker the wood is, right? The weaker the wood, it's easier. What you're looking for with wood glue is you want substrate failure, right? So, I got a call, that's a couple years ago. Guy says, I need your strongest glue. And I said, fine, it'd be Type-On 3, but what are you doing? He says, well, I'm gluing model airplanes together. Normally people would laugh because it was balsa wood, right? Balsa wood will break somewhere around 70 to 100 PSI in a lot of cases, so you really don't need my strongest wood glue for that. How we always look at that is, we call it the chain of adhesion, right? So we got substrate 1, we got adhesion to substrate 1, then we have the glue, then we have substrate 2 and the bond between there, and then the strength of substrate 2. So you can use a 10,000 PSI glue, but if you're gluing paper to steel, at what point does that break, right? It's going to break at its lowest, the weakest chain, all right? The next thing we want to look at is moisture content. So in a lot of cases, if you're using what we call the big three, Type-On Original, Type-On 2, Type-On 3, they're water-based adhesives, right? And so the wood has to absorb this water for the glue to set. At some point in time, there's too much water in the wood for the glue to dry properly. So we do all of our testing at 8% moisture content, but if you start getting above 10% in that, 12 to 15%, above 17, it won't dry at all. As a matter of fact, the wood will have to dry for the glue to dry. And so we get a lot of calls on, can I use this on pressure-treated lumber? You can absolutely use it on pressure-treated lumber as long as they actually dried that pressure-treated lumber. And in most cases, they haven't. In those cases, then you're going to have to change the type of glue that you use, usually a polyurethane glue. Most people know that as Gorilla Glue. We make our own Type-On polyurethane glue, not quite as widely distributed. But so we then at that point have to change the type of glue that we have. But I caution people, when you're using wet wood, is that when it dries, wood does not stay that same shape. right? So wood will shrink in different directions. So a tree kind of is round this way, grows this way. From the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree, the wood shrinks very little. So we can almost ignore that. When we look at the middle of the tree to the outside of the tree, the wood will shrink, say X, a certain amount. And that's going to change with the species of wood, type of tree, where it's grown, climate of the tree, does it have more early wood versus late wood? So it can make a difference. Now, when we look at the shrinkage of wood around the tree, which would be considered the tangential instead of the radial, it shrinks about 2x. And that's why when you see a log drying out, you know, in the sun, typically you're going to see it break like this, right? And the reason is because the outside of the tree is shrinking more than it's shrinking towards the middle of the tree. So typically it's going to crack in that direction. That's why when you see in the lumber yards, they're usually wetting the logs. You see the sprinklers going on the outside of the logs. They're trying to keep the outsides of the logs a little bit wet while the rest of it drains out through the pores of the wood, right? Now, some of the things can happen with that. So if we start with boards that have 6% moisture content on the outside, we've got a board with 10% in the middle. Eventually those boards will equilibrate in moisture content down to 6% here. What's going to happen is that middle board is now going to be thinner. Now, in some cases it doesn't matter, but if anybody here is, and we've gotten calls on this, anybody here has made, $30,000 dining room tables for people, they get very upset when their middle board dips down, right? That's usually not a good sign. We recommend that you're within 1% moisture content at least when you work it. Now, we also see a lot of issues with making cabinet doors. Typically, those panels will crack around the outside because it's shrinking in distance, and so your miters will start to open up, especially if the top boards are different than the side boards in terms of moisture content. So you want to be a little cognizant of that occurring. Okay, the other thing we want to look at is what we call sunken glue joints. All right, let's try that again. All right. So in this particular instance, we'll usually get a call on the phone. We get a couple a month at least, where we'll get a call that says, my glue is creeping from the glue lines, right? Which means they can now feel a glue line, and their thought process is that the glue is actually flowing. Who here has had to scrape off dried wood glue? It's pretty hard plastic, isn't it? So my question back to them is, how much pressure do you have on that piece of wood? They're like, well, there's no pressure. It's a tabletop, for God's sakes, don't you understand? So my statement back to them is, well, then how can you get glue with no pressure on it to extrude from a glue line? Because if you have, you've created free energy and we're all going to be rich, right? So really what happens is, when you glue up with a water-based wood glue, the water's got to go somewhere. It goes into the wood and temporarily swells the wood. If you sand it and plane it before this swelling has gone down, you'll end up with a board that then wood shrinks around the glue line. PVAs don't shrink with changes in moisture. And so what will happen is my glue line will actually be at the same level as the boards. And I will be able to feel a little ridge. Trust me, it is not the glue extruding from the glue line without any force on the glue. Glue is much too hard for that. The other thing that can happen, and this happens generally, now I've got this noted as plain sawn wood, but this typically will happen with rift or quarter sawn wood, more so. And the reason for that is if you look at the growth lines of quarter or rift sawn, they go this way, and because tangential shrinkage is most 2x in this direction, those boards are going to shrink in thickness. The problem that occurs is this will change seasonally. So if I've made my wood at 10%, and then in the winter, while I've got the heat on and the moisture content inside the house goes down, eventually gets to maybe 2 to 4% moisture content. And now I can feel my glue lines. Now to keep this from occurring, what I recommend is go down to the lowest of moisture content, then glue it. A finger typically can't feel it when the glue line is down than say when it is proud. And in some cases I've seen it so bad that it actually pulls a layer of the finish up with it, and you get a white line all the way down the middle of the table. Has anybody ever seen that occur? Anybody do segmented wood turning? So on a segmented wood turning, there's a lot of gluing going on. You got a lot of moisture, but before you've allowed that to equilibrate, you sand it down real smooth and put your finish on it. Then you set it on a shelf, feels nice and feels smooth. After a couple months, now you're putting your hands on it and you can feel every single glue line. This is the same thing that's occurring. So if you want to get your segmented glue lines to have that silky smooth feel all the way through, allow it to dry. All right. The other thing we want to talk about with wood is pitch, oiliness, surfactant contaminants, and extractives. So when we're using tropical woods, what can happen is the tree, as it grows in the forest, it can't move around. So when an infestation of termites come, it can't back away, right? So what the trees have learned to do is to use chemical warfare, right? So the trees produce oils, they produce tannic acids, they produce other chemicals that will help to keep the bugs from eating its supply of cellulose, which is what makes up most of the wood fibers, right? You have lignin, but cellulose is the main derivative there for strength. Now what can happen on oily woods is that water will bead up on the surface. Well, if you're using a water-based wood glue, it's not going to stick very well, right? So we have to remove the oil. So and a lot of people think that glue will stick to the pores of the wood. But that's not the case. Wood sticks to cellulose. And got a presentation on all that, but normally that puts all of you guys to sleep. We talk a little bit of chemistry. I'm a chemist. Exciting for me. But let's just say that cellulose has oxygen and hydrogen groups hanging off of it all over the place. Oxygen loves to hang on to an electron. Hydrogen likes to say goodbye. So the oxygen groups have a net negative charge. The hydrogens have a net positive charge. So cellulose has what we would call like little neodymium magnets all the way down the surface. Wood glues, by chance, also have the same thing. So they link by hydrogen bonding, which is what that's called. And so what happens is the oil is protecting the cellulose from those, and the glue cannot get to those hydroxyl groups. So we have to remove it. The best way to remove tree resins, oils, and etc. is actually acetone. You can use other products. You can use mineral spirits. You can use lacquer thinners. But the problem with those is that they can add oily materials back to the wood. So in a lot of cases, lacquer thinner, it can be any chemical that dissolves lacquer. So I used to work for a company. We used to have to get rid of some hazardous waste. It was kind of oily waste. We would sell that to people who would make lacquer thinner. well, no, it's not illegal because they can put a certain amount of other chemicals in that pass the EPA. Right? So as long as they're below a certain amount, so we pay them thousands of dollars per drum to take this hazardous waste from us, and then they sell it back to you in some of their products. Right? So I mean it's all legal, it's all okay, very small amounts, and it's just basically waste oil is what it is. But the problem is you use those, when you go back in it evaporates, there's just a tiny bit of oil that now you've just left back on the surface of the wood. Acetone does not have it. If it's called acetone, it has to be acetone. And in those cases, it wipes everything off. And you'll see this rag comes back yellow. What you want to do is continue to wipe till the white rag comes back clean. And then you want to get the glue on right away. Because it's the fight between oil and water, right? That wood still has a big reservoir of oil that's happy to come back to the surface. So you want to glue up right away. So if anybody's ever done this to Ipe, you'll get sick of wiping it well before all of the stuff gets off of it, but you'll glue it up anyway, and typically it'll work pretty well. Don't ask me why I know that. So sometimes some of the synthetic non-water-based glues can be used, and they can do a little better of a job sometimes with the oiliness because they will bond to the lignin a little better, but typically they don't increase it all that much. So really, the cleaner the wood, the better the bond. The other thing we want to talk about, come on, you got to let me do this. All right, we won't talk about that because everybody will fall asleep, right? Okay, so the other thing that we want to look for is dark. Well, that didn't even come up. So let me. No, I got the picture up. It's just not presenting on there. I think I'd have to go to this and do the display settings back and duplicate that and then try that again. No. I'll get there, guys. Nope, going the wrong way. That might help. All right, let's try this again. There we go. So we see here, type on 3, and the glue lines get dark. Okay? In some cases black. PVAs will generate, especially type on 2 and type on 3, will generate acetic acid or vinegar during the time. It has to do with hydrolysis of the acetate groups, again, chemistry. Note to say, though, that it's similar. Has anybody ever made a dye out of nails and vinegar? It's the same process that occurs. So there's acetic acid or vinegar that is sometimes present in the glue. If there's iron in the wood, it'll turn brown. And certain oaks will do that. We've seen others. A couple we rarely see. Actually, some guy called it, my glue lines are black, your glue sucks, and all of that. We're like, that wood typically doesn't absorb iron from the soil. And so we questioned it, and we talked, and I said, well, could you have sanded it with anything that may have seen some metal? He goes, oh, well, I recently cleaned off my saw deck with that, and then I sanded the wood with that. So again, if you're seeing your glue lines go black, it's seeing iron from somewhere. If you call us, we may not always know. We can maybe help you look through some of this stuff to try and find out. But just note that's typically what it's going to see. Yeah, let's go back to that one. Close that. Does that look better? back again? Okay, so let's look a little bit at some of the gluing applications. Edge and face gluing, assembly gluing. We'll go through some of the, not too many people do cold and hot pressing, so normally we don't go through that. Edge gluing is used to create larger panels, face gluing to create thicker stock. In all cases, what you want to make sure is that they fit pretty tightly. So let's talk a little bit about clamping. So when we clamp, wherever the clamp jaws hit, we get a cone of force that comes off of those clamps, okay? That cone of force, typically you can think of it as a 45-degree angle in each direction. The stiffer the wood, the higher the angle, the softer the wood, the shorter the angle, right? I mean, but per se, we can look at it at like 45 degree. What we want to do is we want to make sure that they overlap. So we get calls about clamp spacing, you know, should I have them 6 inches apart, should I have them 4 inches apart? I don't know. What you want to do is you want to make sure that, again, you want to get that clamping force across the whole piece. And the reason for that is, think about it, if I had a veneer, and this is an extreme example of a thinner piece onto a thicker piece. If I use clamps for that in the same thing that I had before, what's going to happen? Right? We're going to get some bubbling in those areas we don't have any pressure on, right? So normally when we are dealing with veneers, we would add a caul or an extra piece on top of that and then clamp that in place. So that makes sense, right? So what is the optimum clamping strength? Anybody? So the optimum clamping pressure is the least amount of pressure that you can put on. So we did a test. We had a guy call, he was using Jatoba, and his glues, basically his parts were coming apart. And he said, I'm using the standards that you have posted on your website. And so, you know, we couldn't figure out what was going on. He had cleaned the wood, used acetone and all of that. So he actually sent us some of his pieces in and we ran a test on that. So what we ran was, we used 3 different hardnesses of wood. So we used poplar, maple, and Jatoba. And then we used 3 different clamping forces. We used a 5-pound weight, and we just set the 5-pound weight on top of it. And it worked out to be 0.6 pounds per square inch of pressure on the surface. Then we use our standardized clamping pressure, which is for softwoods 100, medium density 150, for high density 200. And then we went to 1,000 PSI in a carver press. And that was because there was a paper that was out in 1998 that said you could go all the way up to 1,000 without affecting the bond strength. What we found out was that was wrong. What we found in every single case, the 5-pound weight made for the strongest bond. But that varied with hardness of the wood. So with the softwood, the poplar, we only lost about 10% going from the 5-pound weight up to 1,000 PSI. On the medium, though, we lost about 25% of the strength, going up to the 1,000 pound. Now we lost only about 5% for the mid-range. Then, when we went to the Jatoba, in some cases, we took it out of the clamps and it just fell apart. But on average, we lost about 50% or more strength on that product. So we've kind of changed our guidelines for everybody on clamping, right? So we still publish our rules 100, 150 to 200, only because if you've got a stiffer piece of wood and your joint doesn't fit very well, it's going to take some pressure to get it together, right? But just note, your bonds will be weaker. So we don't recommend getting it in the clamp and then give that extra turn just because more is better, right? So at this point in time, what we recommend is just use enough pressure to get your parts together so that the glue can dry properly. Okay? Questions? So next, near and dear to my heart is the drying process of adhesives, right? So this is what wood glues look like under a microscope. Not rocket science, they're just little balls of plastic that float in water, right? So the only thing that occurs when glue dries is they're far apart, lots of water. As the water gets absorbed into the wood and evaporates, they get closer and closer and closer together, right? So at what point is the glue still usable? Well, everybody's rubbed their fingers with glue, right? It's real slippery, and then all of a sudden it gets what I call to the putty point, right? Where it's just, it does not flow. At that point, if you took that glue, rubbed it on a piece of wood, put it together, clamped it, you would not get a bond. You guys can take that home and try it. What happens is at what point is that though? When it starts to get to the putty point? Well, if we fill a jar full of marbles, we can still get a third of that amount of water in the jar. So that's about 67% solids. So we make most of our wood glues at around 50% solids. It's 50% of all those little particles that float in water, and then 50% water. So you've got 17% water to play with. Now we chemically fool with it to make it dewater a little faster for like Type-On Original and 2. That's why they set very quickly. We don't do that with Type-On 3. That's why it gives you the longer working time. So what do we mean by working time? So what we list on ours is open time and then total assembly time. So the open time is the time where you put the glue on the wood and two things are happening. The water is soaking into the wood and the air is evaporating the water, right? Total assembly time is the time where you take that from when you started adding the glue to the time you need to get it in the clamps before the wood gets to the putty point. Because once it gets to the putty point, your glue lines, your bond strength will become weaker. And it'll become weaker and weaker as you get further past that working time, right? And the reason is because if you looked at the picture previously, those particles were about 1 micron, 1/1,000,000th of a meter. And if it's dry to that point, which means it's going to be harder to get it to move, but who here can put their stuff in clamps without it moving? But to break that bond, you only have to move it 1/2 of a millionth of a micron. So I guarantee it's going to move more than that, just clamping it together.
What's your take on using a little bit of salt to keep it from moving when you're clamping?
So salt is fine. We've run studies on that. What happens though is if you're using Type-On 2 or 3 for an exterior project, it does hurt the water resistance a little bit because you're using a water-soluble salt in that process. So yeah, not a problem. We've seen people use that. Also, biscuits and stuff, and we'll talk a little bit more about biscuits and dowels. That'll all help you with that alignment process because that glue can get pretty slippery. So as long as there is glue that's not in its putty point within that glue line, you're fine. If all of the glue gets to that putty point, then your bonds are going to be weaker. So the question that we come up with is, one or two-sided gluing. Who here is a two-sided gluer? One-sided gluing? We need more participation in this group. Because obviously you guys aren't gluing anything. So, but anyway, one-sided or two-sided gluing, you're fine. Okay? Either will work. There's advantages and disadvantages to each one. So with one-sided gluing, that is the only way you're going to get invisible glue lines. And the reason for that is everybody's rubbed glue on a glue and it's gotten draggy, right? When you first put the glue on, glue gets a little draggy, you got to put a little more glue on. When that glue is draggy, that means it's gotten to its putty point, okay? And it will immediately get a layer of putty glue as soon as it touches the wood. Okay, and then the longer you wait, the puttiness moves up and out. But as long as you have that slippery layer, it'll work fine. Now, the problem with being a one-sided gluer is you better have an egg timer because you are up against the clock in terms of keeping it from puttying up on you before you can get everything together. As a demonstration of that, I'm going to slide this. So this is a newel post, or part of a newel post, that we had talked to the gentleman on the phone. Again, he complained that my glue sucked. He did everything correct, and he was using Type-On 2. Okay, Type-On 2 is one of our most notorious issues for fast-setting glue. Okay, one of our faster setting glues, unless you go with the Quick and Thick or our new Speed Set. Okay, so we talked and we talked and we talked. Everything was fine. I said, you know, at this point, I don't know if I can help you. If you send in a sample, maybe we can understand what's going on. Now, at this point, for the most part, no one sends us stuff. This guy actually did. So from this sample, I can absolutely tell you what happened. So he was a one-sided gluer, and with Type-On 2, that's a feat, right? So this post is, I mean, think of the post is you know, pretty long, right? So if you imagine the gluing surfaces, right? So what he did was, he took this and he glued this surface first. Then he turned it over and put glue on this side. And then he put glue on this side. How do I know that? Because on this surface, I can see that all of the glue dried on the surface, nothing transferred, very little transferred to this side, and it was dry before he got it together. On this particular one, I can see glue again on this side, but in some cases, I can see actual wood fibers tearing. So he was close, but not close enough. This one we couldn't get apart. That was the last one he glued, and then he put them together. Obviously the glue was wet still when he got that together. It was dry. So that is the difference between successful and non-successful gluing. Okay? So if you're a one-sided gluer, speed is your friend. Now, two-sided gluing, the advantage is that you're going to be assured that the wood is wet with glue on one side, it is wet with glue on the other side. Thing is, you're going to be using twice as much glue, and we thank you very much. And the issue is it just starts to squeeze out all over the place and can get pretty messy. But typically you're going to have a lot more working time with it. Because like I said, you only need one layer of glue that is still liquid in between there. That'll help it flow out and wet the surfaces.
So wait until it's just a little bit tacky on both sides, and then gluing it together is the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing.
That is correct.
Okay.
You do not want to wait. As soon as the glue gets on, put it together. Question?
That was my point, is that in the session we had on Saturday a couple weeks ago, you said that you might want to let it, the air get at the glue for 5 minutes or something like that before you put it together.
So now that you know the science of what glue is, does that make sense? So you don't want the water to evaporate. You don't want to get it to tack up. You want it to be wet. You want some squeeze out. If you allow it to dry a little further, your glue lines get thicker too. And so that becomes an issue.
I'm a one-sided gluer, and if I feel like I'm gonna have a longer assembly time, then I usually will take a wet paper towel and rub the other side.
Right.
And that seems to help.
Yeah, and what may help a little bit more is before you put the glue on, wet the side that you're putting the glue on.
Okay.
And that's going to keep the wood from wanting to soak the moisture out. So you can really get unlimited working time. One is moisten the joints, right? So the wood doesn't want to take any more water out of the glue. And then get a humidifier and just blow, you know, those ultrasonic humidifiers, just blow water, you know, high humidity over your glue up area. The glue isn't gonna dry through the air, it's not gonna dry through the wood, but this becomes the issue, right? Now I've got more water in the system, the wood's gonna swell a little bit more, I'm gonna have to wait longer to start processing that wood, right? So again, there's pluses and minuses to everything, right? I get it glued together, but then I gotta wait 2 or 3 weeks before I can really start sanding that down, right? So again, always trade-offs in woodworking.
What about an application, or how to apply it and how much to put on?
So the rule of thumb is 250 square feet per gallon. I always like that. I always get the look, because it's always, you're chugging, no. So really about the thickness of heavy construction paper. It doesn't need to be a lot of glue, but again, the less glue, faster it dries, right? And so that becomes, you know, if you are in the business of producing, getting things out the door, you want to use as little glue as possible, right? So you're going to set up systems where, you know, you apply the least amount of glue, get your things together, and move them on, right? So people who are in production hate Type-On 3 because it just sets so slow. It's got long working time, long open time, but it sets a lot slower. So you can't get it in and out of the clamps like you can with Type-On 2 and Type-On Original. That's why Type-On Original kind of took over the furniture industry back in the 50s from high glue. High glue had that, you know, that hot high glue had that quick set, right? Type-On Original has that same thing. We use borax to coagulate the glue, so as soon as it gets to a certain concentration, it basically just takes those particles and just locks them together. And that's what gives Type-On Original and 2 that very, very fast set characteristic. But it's not for everybody, right? And like the guy who does it, you know, because that's, well, I've always used it, never had a problem, right? Well, you just did. So then let's take a little look at assembly gluing, right? So now that we know about water, movement into the glue lines and things like that, one of the most difficult joints to glue properly is a mortise and tenon joint, right? Because in essence, I can take a nice tight-fitting mortise and tenon joint and glue that together with water, and I will not be able to get that apart, correct? For a couple of weeks.
Until it dries out.
Right, I mean, so if you've got like a, you know, 8-quarter board and you've got something in the middle of that, how long does 8-quarter take to air dry?
Depends on the species.
Yeah, so it could fit pretty well for a while. So let's say I'm gluing one tight-fitting joint with water-based wood glue. I put the glue on, I put it in there, and I got 4 or 5, you know, 4 of them that I'm, maybe 8 of them because I'm doing a chair. By the time I get done, I put that and I hammer them in because they fit a little bit tighter than they used to. And then I squeeze off all the glue, but it sure fits and feels pretty good, right? So again, be cognizant of that. You want to get those mortise and tenon joints, if you're using a water-based wood glue, get them together pretty quick. If they're loose, you know, put the glue on, they'll swell a little bit, they'll feel a lot better. Like the glue's doing a pretty good job, because it'll get a little bit tighter. But the glues are 50% solid, so they're gonna shrink as they dry, right? And so in some of those cases, if you've got too much gap in there, the glue will shrink and you'll get kind of air bubbles in there. And anytime you get an air bubble in a mortise and tenon joint, especially on a chair that may see some racking, it may move a little tiny bit. That little tiny bit of movement will then cause maybe a fiber to break, which will allow for a little more movement, which will allow more fibers to break. And that's why chairs tend to have to be repaired a lot, because they're those mortise and tenons that they use to put together these nice chairs are very difficult to glue. To be perfectly honest, the best way is to make them a little bit loose and use epoxy. The epoxy will dry 100%, fill in all the gaps, and then that will have no movement. Again, sometimes though, you know, if you're putting the wood in places that are expanding and contracting, epoxies can be a little brittle, right? They hold too tightly to the wood. Our water-based wood glues are a little bit flexible, especially 2 and 3. They're flexible because when you use them for exterior and the wood gets wet, it's going to expand. Then the sun comes out and it dries them, right? So there's a lot of this going on with exterior glued wood. Well, our Type on 2 and Type on 3 are designed to be softer. If you ever took a film of that, you could bend it. Whereas Type on original, which is just used indoors, is pretty brittle. And there's a reason for that. And not only that, but if you took that film, put it under water, it would get real flexible. You go, well, that shouldn't happen. That glue's got to be strong. Well, when you think about it, now that we know about wood movement, when wood gets wet, it gets weaker, right? So if that glue had that same strength, even when the wood got wet, again, it would start to pull fibers. You don't want it to pull fibers. You want it to, when the wood dries out, the glue hardens back up. And it's exactly what Type on 2 and 3 do. Now, unlike polyurethane glues tend to be very brittle. And so as that wood expands and contracts, it tends to put a lot of stress on the wood fibers. And in that case, we've all seen it, you glue something up with a polyurethane, you put it outside, and after a couple of years, the joints are kind of coming apart. And that's because that glue is just so hard that any movement will tend to start damaging fibers. Now, it won't totally come apart because in the middle, you know, where the movement is, you know, zero, it's moving on the edges, right? That's where you start to see gaps in the wood. So again, you want to be cognizant of that. The other thing that we look at is dovetails, right? So a dovetail is a mechanically locking joint. What's the glue doing? So basically what the glue is doing is it's keeping you from banging the sides out of it so the joint comes apart, right? So do you need glue on every single corner and piece of that dovetail joint? Really, in essence, you don't. You're really only tacking that joint together to keep the sides from bursting up. All of the force on that is used in the mechanical direction. That's why we designed the pins and tails in certain directions. The other part of that is, and we'll get to another slide, is it's difficult to take that apart. Now, tongue and groove, corner blocks, dowels. Let's talk a little bit about dowels and biscuits. So I've seen people take tabletops, put big dominoes in them all the way down, stick glue in all of the corners and put them together. The problem comes in is you've just put a lot of water in the middle of that board. And in some cases, when you go to sand that down, I don't know if anybody's ever seen a tabletop where you can see a little indentation where every biscuit or every domino has been put in there. Same thing as sanding the joints too early, right? So all of that moisture has to come out before you can really sand it, and that can take quite a while. And those depressions show up sometimes years down the road, depending on the thickness of the table. So what I'm saying, they're great for alignment purposes. Put a little bit of glue in to tack them into place, but they're really not adding all that much strength to your projects. As a matter of fact, they can make them weaker. And let me tell you how, right? So if you just glued edge to edge board together, that's going to break wood, right? Now let's say I put a domino in there. I'd probably cut away half of the wood, right? Which means I got probably a quarter of the wood above it and a quarter of the wood below it. When I stress that joint and bend it, what happens with the dominoes? They want to break through the surface there or through the bottom, right? and they only have to break through 1/4 of the wood now, instead of the whole table. So again, good for alignment purposes. Don't feel you've got to glue them all into place. I mean, while you're spreading the glue will get into the holes, trust me. You know, do both sides in that case, get a little bit more, that'll tack them in place so that when you get them together, they're not gonna rattle about if the wood gets dry and the biscuits dry out. Hot and cold pressing, I'm not gonna go into unless somebody's doing some hot and cold pressing in place. Typically not too many people do it. I've had a couple where they have. So just a note that the wood glues bond to cellulose. When we look at end grain, lots of cellulose, lots of air. So if glues bonded through the pores of the wood, and by roughing up the surface, et cetera, what would be the strongest bond if it was a mechanical bond? End grain, right? But we know end grain isn't the strongest of the bonds. So typically, a lot of our joinery that we do for joints that come in at 90 degrees is to maximize the side-to-side grain that we're bonding, right? Because there's a lot of cellulose, very little cellulose. It's kind of like bonding to the edges of straws, right? I got a lot of air space, but not a lot of bonding space there, okay? And we've got a glue, our type on Quick and Thick now. It used to be called No Run, No Drip, or Molding and Trim Glue. But what we have found is the Quick and Thick is a very good glue for a lot of generalized woodworking, not just molding and trim. The problem is we tell people, you can use molding and trim for this. And they pick up the bottle and go, nope, it says molding and trim, can't use it for that. So we've changed our marketing group has changed it quite a bit. Right now it's called Quick and Thick in a silver bottle. That is a very interesting glue. It's very thick so it doesn't drip and run. For molding, that's important that it doesn't drip on the carpet. The other thing is that it's designed to be very, very flexible. Okay, so I can take a molding strip on a door, or the side of a cabinet, and not use any pin nails. Put the glue just on the bonding surface, rub it in place, hold it for like 15, 30 seconds, and then I can let go. I mean, it's not fully strong, but it's enough to hold the weight. What's nice about this glue is it allows, remember what we talked about with wood movement. The side of that cabinet is going to be doing this. That trim piece is not going to be moving. And so we need, that glue really helps in terms of allowing for that movement. It's soft enough to allow the movement and not break the wood or put enough pressure on that. So those are a couple things about that particular glue. Couple gluing applications. You want to keep the glue from freezing. Now, most of our glues are designed to take 5 to 10 freeze-thaw cycles. But testing in our lab, when we do it, we test it, freeze it, and then we mix it, take a viscosity to see if it's thickened up, and we put it back in the freezer. So if you let it freeze, thaw, and then freeze again without mixing it, sometimes it can go bad. Okay? But if it's frozen once in your car on the way you forgot it and you brought it in, it's frozen solid, just thaw it out, mix it before you use it, and it should be fine. So what happens is we've got the little particles of glue. When water freezes, it likes to stick to itself. More ice crystals, it expands and kind of disglued the particles from that ice crystal. And so they tend to jam them kind of together. It's glue. It likes to stick together. Now, in most cases, there's enough water in there to allow the particles not to get too crowded together for the first time. Right now, if then I leave it in the car and then freeze it again, the particles are closer together this time. Now the ice particles are going to shove them closer together. So each subsequent freeze thaw without breaking those particles up will cause the glue to go bad. Now, if it's a glue that has a high solids anyway, like the Quick and Thick, if it freezes once, you might as well just toss it out. The other thing we want to talk about is chalking temperature. Okay, so this is the formula for Type-On Original. Go ahead. Write it down. All right, time's up. So when we look at a wood glue, when it dries, it goes from particles all over to what's called a coalesced film. So if we look at this film, all of the little particles have melted together. Right? You can kind of see here's the bigger particles, here's your smaller ones, and they fill in. And that's what makes the glue strong. It forms a film of plastic. There is, though, a temperature, and it is written on every bottle, at which you have to be above or the glue will chalk. And when we say chalk, it will not melt together, but it will stay as discrete particles instead. Okay? And what can happen is, if it's bad enough, if you're much lower than the chalk point, the bond will just come apart and you rub your finger on it, it'll just be dusty. Okay? What you're feeling is each of the individual particles that have been freeze-thawed, right? Or freeze-dried, one would say. Now, to get that to go back, we put chemicals in there to allow it to coalesce at those temperatures, right? Once those chemicals have evaporated, to get this to melt together again, you need about 250 degrees. Okay? So that 250 degrees is kind of important. So if you want to do veneering, but you don't have a press or cauls, or you're doing a tabletop and you don't have a press that large, you can do what is called iron-on veneering. So what you do is you take the glue, put it on your substrate, MDF or whatever you're using, or poplar, let it dry, take the back of the veneer, put glue all on that, let it dry. At that point, I put the veneer on, set it where I want it, get an iron on cotton setting, that'll get the glue quickly to the 250 degrees, and start working the middle in big circles to get out all the air, and I could put that veneer down perfectly without it. Type-On Original tends to work the best for that because it's got a very sharp melting point. So what it does is, as soon as it hits the melting point, it gets very liquid, and then 1 or 2 degrees cooling, solidifies right back up to full strength again. So it works very well, but that's the temperature that you got to get dried glue up to before it'll flow. Okay, we talked about sunken glue joints. Let's talk a little bit about clamping time.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
So if you've got something glued together, you do the same thing to get it apart by heating it up to 250 degrees?
Heating it up will soften the glue, yes.
Just like when you work with high glue, you could literally do that with your...
So high glue has extremely high heat resistance. As a matter of fact, it'll burn before it melts. However, has horrible humidity resistance, so you can steam them apart.
Okay.
Yeah, and the reason I say that, make the contention, because I had a guy call, he said, I just want to tell you that I'm really mad. And I said, okay, what's going on? He said, well, I had to get a piece of this high glue apart. I put it in my oven, heated it up, and tried to get it apart, and it broke the wood. I am very angry. I said, well, did you put a pan of water in the oven with it? Why would I need that? He said, because it's not resistant to moisture, but very resistant to heat. And so that's why you make musical instruments with it, because if somebody keeps it in their hot car, high glue will not come apart. Whereas some of the softer stuff under those pressures can soften and pull the bridge off of your guitars or something like that. So again, questions? So let's talk a little bit about clamping time. How long do you have to keep it in the clamps? You give me a call and I'm going to tell you, I don't know. And the reason I'm going to tell you that is because I don't know what the moisture content of your wood is. Right? We talked a little bit about that. It's got to dry. We typically will test at 8% moisture content, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 50% relative humidity. So all of our testing stuff is based upon that. So with Type-On Original, we typically say 30 minutes minimum clamp. Now with Type-On Original and 2, I would say you're pretty safe. As a matter of fact, we've got companies, again, time is money for these companies, you know, get them in and out of the clamps. They take them out of the clamps in 10 minutes. I don't recommend that. For us, we would say, you know, if you want to guarantee 24 hours is great if you got it overnight. Type-On 3, we'll say 30 minimum on there. I personally would say 2 hours for clamping. It does set a little bit slower. But again, it's going to depend on your moisture content of your wood. I mean, that's going to be your driving factor there. So anything above 10%, double. Anything above 11%, triple. Anything above 12, quadruple, et cetera, until you get to 17, and then all bets are off. It's not going to dry at all. Then you're going to want to go with a polyurethane at that point. One thing nice about polyurethanes, though, is that they do not swell the wood. So if you needed to get a table put together, and you got to sand it, get it out for a Christmas present, and it's New Year's Eve, or Christmas Eve, sorry, Christmas Eve. Glue it with polyurethane glue. You've got to clamp it for 4 hours because that's how long that reaction takes. But after that 4 hours, once the glue is fully cured, you're ready to go, right? And one of the ways to tell whether your polyurethane is good or not is to just take a bead of polyurethane glue and put it on a piece of scrap wood and just leave it off to the side. As soon as that gets hard as a rock or foamed up and everything's cured and it's not gooey, it's good inside of your wood too. Okay? All right.
What is the shelf life of, say, Type-On 2?
Okay, so when we look at shelf life, so shelf life is a legal statement, right? Which is, because once it leaves our place, we can't dictate how it's stored. So no matter how poorly you store it, that's what we're going to say, right? So typically Type-On 2, 3, original, 2-year shelf life, official. But what you care about, you don't care about that because it's kind of like milk. On the expiration date, 1 second before I can drink it, the next second I can't drink it because it's expired, right? So that's really not the case, right? So the case is, what's the usable life of the product, right? How long will it last if I store it in good conditions? And normally, we usually give it about half of what it will go in the lab. So normally Type-On 2 and 3, which are reactive glues, after about 4 to 5 years, at room temperature, they'll usually gel after about 4 or 5 years. If you keep them in the refrigerator, that's a glue fridge, not a beer fridge, they'll last about 10 years. But I'm going to tell you, if you got a bottle of Type-On 2 that's lasting you 10 years, you need more projects. Type-On Original and all of the other non-reactive adhesives, those that don't get water resistant, typically I've seen bottles 10 years old still usable. So the rule of thumb is, if I squeeze the bottle easily and the glue comes out, it's usually a good sign. If you're struggling to get that glue out of the bottle, it might be time for a new bottle. Polyurethane glues typically have like a 1-year shelf life. Our Extend glues have a 1-year shelf life just because they settle. The polyurethane glue, they'll get kind of crusty in the bottle. Store them upside down, the crustiness will come on the top and the bottom, but the glue in the middle will still be good, right? So the objective is try and get the glue out of the bottom. Or squeeze all the air out of the polyurethane before you cap it. Because it's moisture that cures the polyurethane glue. And any air that gets in the bottle is going to bring in moisture. And so whatever moisture is in the bottle is going to cure those polymer chains up until it uses all the moisture up, then it's going to stop. And that's why the outside gets crunchy, because water actually can get into the bottle through the plastic. Every plastic bottle has a moisture vapor transmission rate, and it's dependent upon the thickness. We try and use thick bottles, but again, they can get harder to squeeze once you get them too thick. So we talked about clamping pressure, joint preparation. You want to make sure it's clean. You want to make sure your parts fit together well. better fitting joints make for stronger joints. I think most people kind of understand that. The glue can do things like holding a joint together that's not fitting well together, but note that that joint is going to have stresses on it from day one. And stress, excess stress on the glue line will cause it to wear faster. So maybe not in your lifetime with Type-On products, but somebody's gonna have to repair your stuff. Okay? So design your joints to handle the stress. Make sure the joint is working in conjunction with the glue, right? And not against it in those cases. Clean up. So if you ever get Type-On on a shirt or on something that you want to keep, make sure your shirt doesn't get in the dryer till you get it out. The best thing to soften Type-On glue is a mixture of acetone, water, and vinegar. And even if Type-On 2 has sat on your shirt and dried pretty well, it'll soften it so you can scrape it and then just repeat until you get it out. Once it goes in the dryer, what happens in the dryer, you saw how the film coalesces into a film and you can see the discrete particles. After it goes in the dryer, there are no discrete particles, it's just one solid film of plastic. And so now you have a plastic spot on your shirt. Wear it proudly.
What about miter joints? Any thoughts on that, since almost end-to-end joints?
So, when we look at designing our furniture, right? So, miter joints for picture frames that say on the wall, they don't see a lot of stress, right? So we can glue those, the Type-On Quick and Thick. I don't clamp my picture frames, my miters, any longer. I have a flat table and a 90-degree jig, glue the sides, rub them together, hold them for 15 seconds, and I can pick it up and then glue the other two together. You know, wait 5-10 minutes until it bodies up a little bit more, and then put glue on the other end, make sure your table's flat, so that your miters, all your angles line up, and then glue that, get it straight where you want it, and then just walk away.
So what glue did you say you use?
The Quick and Thick.
Quick and Thick.
Yeah, a lot of people normally they give me, and I would typically have samples for you guys of all of these glues that we talked about. Probably has supply chain issues. No, seriously, we got nothing in our warehouse. Everything we make is getting shipped right now. Problem is we sell through distribution, so we don't have coupons. But you know, we'll order 10 rail cars of vinyl acetate to make the PVA. 4 will show up. So it's been not fun. Let's put it that way. So we've typically normally ship within 4 days of an order. I mean, we're out 4 weeks to 12 weeks shipping stuff. So just a note, if you have trouble finding some of this stuff out there, give us a call. We can sometimes get you to other places around. Just call the 800 number on the bottle. Sometimes we'll be able to find somebody who's gotten a shipment recently and kind of send you in that direction. But it usually goes pretty fast. So we're going to look at the 5 steps for successful gluing. The first one is to do a dry fit. This is normally when my wife comes to these presentations, she'll just start laughing because I don't always do it. But I can tell you what our number 1 call is that we get. Once I glue something together, how do I get it apart? Right? So normally what we're going to ask you is a couple questions, right? What's the type of joint and what type of glue did you use, right? And the reason is because some joints are going to be easier to get apart than others, right? So if I've got a pinned mortise and tenon joint, that ain't going to happen. If you have fully glued all of your pins and tails on a dovetail, ain't going to happen either. But if you've tacked it in place instead, in some cases heating it, I mean, you don't have a full thing of something to heat up and then push apart. The looser the joints were in the first place, sometimes can make it easier. Obviously, miter joints would be easy to get apart in those particular cases. But some glues will be harder to get apart than other glues. I mean, if you use hide glue was originally designed, a lot of the luthiers still continue to use it because it's more repairable. I can get it, I can steam them apart very easily. And not only that, so you can use, we have our liquid hide glue. I don't know if anybody's ever used that. But you can take our liquid hide glue, put it on a piece of copy paper, just make you a film of it like that, and just let it dry, and it'll, because it swells and shrinks with moisture. And as a matter of fact, if you do a tabletop with hide glue, the hide glue will actually swell and shrink with the moisture content of the wood. So you don't get those issues that you do with the PVA, because the plastics don't swell and shrink with moisture. But take that paper and it'll curl right up because the glue shrinks. On humid days, that paper will open right up. So you can use it as a hygrometer, put it in your shop, hang it on the wall. 3 years ago, so I've got this hanging in my office, right? And as of Friday, it was curled up tight because it was, you know, you walk on the carpet and you snap, you get the picture. So it's been pretty dry. But about 2 summers ago, it got so humid in our offices that the glue re-liquefied and ran down the paper and onto the carpet. So I do know from experience that the higher the humidity that you get, that glue will actually liquefy back again. So, but if you're going to get it apart, it's just going to be a struggle, right? I mean, you're just going to have to work it as best you can. Some cases, sometimes if you've got a CA glue, they tend to be a little more brittle. You can hit them, you know, give them a sharp tap with a hammer. Sometimes they'll just shatter apart. You know, and that's why some people like it for turning. You know, you could glue the wood onto the metal, what do we call that again? The plate, the metal plate. And if you tap the metal plate with a hammer, I mean, that CA glue will just release right away. So in some cases, you can utilize that issue. But in most cases, I mean, we may just say, sorry, it's time to make some new parts. So let's say I do get my bond apart. Can I reglue it with PVA? Our initial thought was no, really, you can't. But we've done a test on it. Our control test is just regular glued up. This one we left, so this one, let's say I glue it together, and it's just not right. I just glued it together, and remember it got to the putty point, and it's hard to get apart, but I could kind of snap it apart without breaking the wood. In those cases, if I then re-glue it, so it's glued up 5 minutes, now I take it apart in 5 minutes, and then I put some glue on and redo it. Actually, it's a little bit stronger. The glue lines are thick, but it glues up pretty good. You know, up to 117% of the original strength. If I wait 17 hours and then glue it up, so I take it apart and go, I don't have time to glue it, I gotta go, and then do it, about 78% of the bond strength. If I then take that bond that I took apart and use an epoxy, I can get back to them. But again, you're looking at some of those as the glue lines start to look pretty awful at that point in time. And in some cases, you may just want to take the glue off and start over at that point in time. But it is possible to do it. So in this proper case, you want, make sure your alignment is correct. This is what a dry fit is for. You can test how many clamps you're going to need, because when you glue up, that's not the time to be yelling at everybody, more clamps, right? You get to look where you need to maybe fix a joint a little bit. Loose ones may need an epoxy. You also look at it when you dry fit to look for, I got to sand this thing afterwards, right? In those cases, I may get some squeeze out in areas that are just going to be really difficult to get to. In those cases, you may want to get some masking tape on those joints and then just cut them apart. The squeeze out will go onto the masking tape, making that job a lot easier, as long as you don't wait overnight to get that off. Normally you want to wait till it putties up.
What's the best way to clean squeeze out? Because I've read that if you use wet rag, that can be bad and so forth.
So we did a study on that because Harp Designs they make furniture for fixer-upper. Yeah. He was doing a table, and he's got a video on that, where, you know, he's got 8-quarter walnut, he's got dominoes, and he's slathering glue all over the place, filling the holes. You can see, I mean, we love him. And the glue is just running all over the place. He puts the clamps on, and they must have, you know, rehearsed this, but he holds his hand up, and the guy slaps a rag on it. You could hear how wet this rag was, and he starts wiping, right? And we're like, oh my gosh, you don't want to do that. And one of our testing guys was looking at it, and he goes, how do you know? Did you test that? And we're like, anybody here test that? Nobody tested it. Everybody's like, well, we thought that, you know, you'll get the glue soaking into the pores of the wood, and it's going to cause an issue with finishing it. So we did a test, and we found that, because normally our recommendation is wait 20 minutes or so until the glue putties up. Once it putties up, it can't flow, right? So it'll roll across the surface, and it may look like it's getting all over the place, but it doesn't. It just rolls on the surface, and it sands off real easily. So what we did was we took some walnut, glued them together. We did the putty, wait for it to putty up. Then we took a wet rag, I mean a soaking wet rag, and just went over the surface with it. Then we took it and waited overnight and tried to scrape it. There was one other one, I can't remember what it was. But then what we did was we sanded it with a 5-pound weight on a random orbital sander for a minute. And then we tested it with mineral spirits to see if we could see any glue still on the surface, right? It keeps it whiter looking. What we found was that the wet rag was really the best. What it did was it raised the grain. It looks awful when you're done, but it's just raised grain. And we had to change the test to less than a minute, so it was like 30 seconds of sanding, and it was ready to go. Wait for it to putty up and then scrape it off. That just a minute, so not bad. The one where we scraped the glue off, took chunks out of the wood, and we ended up sanding that for like 4 hours before we could get it down. I mean, obviously we would have planed it down, but we did the sanding test on it. So, best way, use the wettest rag you can get. Now, the problem with that is, then you got water on your wood, and then you got to allow it to dry, and then all of that. So we still go with the wait 20 minutes till the glue putties up. Once it's puttied up, you know, it's relatively easy to scrape up. Type on 3 though if you've got some bigger squeeze out. Just a note on that, when it dries, it gets a skin over the top of it, and it is so water resistant that the water underneath can't get out. And so what can happen is you go to putty scrape it, and it's not putty, it just gets all over the place. So you got to kind of pull the skin off of it, let that dry, pull the skin off of it. Depending on the big puddle you have, you may be doing that quite a while. Don't ask me how I know that one. Yeah, I had a cabinet that, you know, I put a joint on, and all the glue just dripped to the bottom of the cabinet, and I thought, I'll just let it dry. So I went to go scrape it. I mean, it was still wet after a day. It took me a week of pulling the skin off before it got all of the glue up, so. Yeah. So anyway, masking, bridge any edge-to-edge joints with a clamp to keep them from creeping or moving when you can look at moisture content, make sure it's within 1%. Clean any sawdust off. So then we want to prepare the glue. You want to determine what the correct glue is. Make sure your glue's in good condition. If there's a question about it, I mean, it could be 1,000 years old. Take it, glue 2 scrap pieces of wood together, because from your project you actually have the wood that you use that you're gluing together. Take 2 scrap pieces together, put the glue on there, clamp it overnight, and break it with a hammer. If you're getting wood failure and the glue is 1,000 years old, feel free to use it. There's no reason to really throw glue away if it's still working. So we used to, on our high glue, liquid high glue, we used to have a 1-year shelf life on it. When one of the older guys retired, we were cleaning up his office and found a cache of liquid high glue that was, one bottle was 26 years old, one of them was 12 years old, and then the other one was like 5 years old. So we went and glued stuff up with it. The 26-year-old bottle of glue still broke wood. It was softer, and you could see that it would goo a little bit more. It dried a little bit differently, but it still broke wood. So we changed it to a 2-year shelf life, because again, that's usually our longest shelf life that we're gonna put out there, just because we don't control how people store it. And took off the expiration date on it, because we don't want you guys throwing good glue away. Stir the glue, especially the extends, they tend to settle. If you don't stir them, at the end you're gonna have a bottle full of mud, and it is mud, because we add clay to that to fill the pores of the wood, to keep the glue from drying too fast. And so, if you didn't, then you were just using Type-On Original anyway. So it doesn't matter that you use the Extend version at that point in time. Clean your tips, clean your brushes, just get everything ready. Get some water handy for your water-based wood glues for cleanup. If you're using the urethane glue, the polyurethane glue, acetone typically cleans it up much better. Mineral spirits will do okay. But again, spread some plastic. Make sure that your clamps aren't the wood's not gonna hit any of your iron pipes on your clamps, because you get that black stain in there, and that stain goes really deep because it is a dye, right? It's a water-based dye. Again, same thing as making nails in vinegar, that colorant. So during the glue up, make sure your shop is above temperature. Not only that, make sure your wood is above temperature. Normally, starting in November, we'll get calls from Canada. Your glue socks, I glued this up, took it out of the clamps, and it came apart. Well, question is your shop? Yeah, my shop's at 75 degrees. So where'd you get the wood? When did you bring it in the shop? 24 hours beforehand? Well, no, I just pulled it in from the garage. It's 0 degrees outside. So the glue is quickly going to get to the temperature of the wood, right? So to make sure your wood is up in temperature, consider gluing in stages. We want to know the assembly time. If you're a single-sided gluer, get an egg timer. When the timer goes off, be sure that you're about ready to get finished clamping. Use whatever method to spread the glue as quickly as you can. If you've got a large surface area, get a resilient flooring trowel, the little the 3/30 seconds U-notch trowel tends to spread glue very, very fast. You can just take the whole cap off, group it in the middle, and just spread. That gives you 250 square feet per gallon, by the way, according to the manufacturer of the trowels. So peel off any masking tape once the glue gets slightly rubbery. You don't want to wait till it fully glues, because not only are you going to be scraping glue off, but you'll be scraping tape off too. And that makes it even harder. Use wax paper under your clamps to get any squeeze out. Again, after you're done, be nice to clean the caps out. Just put them under running water. By the way, the clear thing pops all the way off if you ever have to clean those out. If you ruin your caps or anything like that, give us a call. We'll send you a couple in the mail. And then the hardest thing to do is to wait. Best to leave for 24 hours, and then if sunken glue joints might be a problem. Somebody asked me, well, how long do I have to leave it to keep the sunken glue joints from occurring? And I told them, 7 days. And at that point he started choking. I said, most people will leave it 3 days. And he was still kind of choking. And I said, otherwise just go ahead and sand away and see what happens. So your chances of success increase with the drier that the wood is. Okay, any questions?
What's your take on miter or in grain if you prime it a little and then reapply the glue?
So we did a test on that. What we did was we found what we did was we primed it, then we primed it with full strength glue, we primed it with half strength glue, then we glued it up as normal, and then we did our tight bond quick and fit. What we found was waste of time, really good, okay. So really just gluing it up as normal. Just glue, make sure you have enough glue on though, because remember, that glue is gonna start wicking water away. I always say you gotta be a two-sided gluer if you're gonna do end grain. Just because you gotta make sure that that glue is wet when those two things meet.
Well, that probably comes from when, before quick and thick and all of that.
Right.
With white glue,
Yeah, I mean, if you put enough glue on, you don't see an issue. Just glue it up as you normally would.
Locally, Type Bond 2 is $18 a gallon.
Okay?
Type Bond 3 is $20 a gallon.
Okay?
28. 18 and 28. Except for exterior projects, what other, and open time, what other advantages is there to Type Bond 3?
Really just, so Type Bond 3 will pass a boiling water soak. Who here boils their furniture? I mean, no one boils their furniture. I mean, if you're doing cutting boards that might end up in a dishwasher, then maybe, because I mean, we've tested, there's a guy out here who makes cutting boards. He says they'll stay together through a dishwasher cycle. Again, he doesn't recommend it, but at least you can refinish it and start over again, right? It's not gonna come apart again. Type Bond 2 will. Other than the longer working time, not really a big issue.
You said the strongest glue was Type Bond 3.
Again, what wood are you working with? So most of your domestic species here break between 2,000 and 3,000 PSI. Type Bond 3 will get up to 4,000. We're finding it hard to buy wood that we can actually find to test that high strength. Because the rock maple that we typically buy, I mean, it's breaking more at like 3,200 PSI. So we can't even find wood, because if I break a bond and the wood breaks, I'm not testing the glue, I'm testing the wood. That's gonna tell me what the wood strength is. It tells me nothing about the glue. It tells me nothing about the glue. So sometimes you'll get a batch where you'll get some breakage of wood, and then I'll get up around 4,400 PSI. But it's rare. We're having trouble finding wood strong enough to test our glues anymore. So,
All right, gluing oily species. Yes, we're supposed to wipe it down with acetone. Yes, we're supposed to rough it up with a little bit of sandpaper.
don't rough it. No need to rough it.
Okay.
No need to rough it. Usually finish on there. So this is what happens. So if you rough it up, say with an 80 grit, when you break it apart, you're gonna see a lot more wood failure, okay? But if you did a strength test on the joint, the joint actually breaks at a lower temperature, at a lower strength. And it's similar to, you see a little piece of wood hanging up, and then you grab that end and you try and pull it off, and it just rips into the grain. It's kind of the same thing. You're gluing to damaged fibers. And those damaged fibers, when you pull it, usually break right along the grain line there. So you get more wood failure, but it's not as strong. So we found that a good hand plane finish is the best. And the reason the hand plane is better than, say, a machine cut joint is because machine cut joints, if the blade is a little dull, will tend to burnish the wood, right, or polish it, or even get you dark burn marks. Those dark burn marks are where you have taken the cellulose and converted it to carbon char. Glues will not bond to carbon char, they bond to cellulose. So when you take a hand plane, there's no heat involved, you're taking off that top layer, now I've got a really nice smooth gluing surface. Or if you want a hand, or even take your random orbital sander, usually about 220 to 320 grit, usually all you need, is all you need. You wanna make sure your parts are fitting together nice and tight. That is the key to a strong joint.
In the wintertime, my van was like a rolling toolbox.
Okay?
And, lot of indoor trim, newel posts, balusters. Always like to put a little glue on my miters. And so consequently, if it's wintertime and the van gets cold at night and the glue is constantly changing, you know, if the temperature's 10 degrees outside.
Yep.
And then it's just a challenge to keep fresh glue
Understood.
in your truck to where
Yep,
it
yep.
can be at its maximum strength.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you could get you a nice a cooler with a hot water bottle, just put it in there overnight. You just wanna keep it above freezing. Really, freezing for glues tend to be around 24, 22 degrees. It's not freezing, so there's some salts added to it, similar to, and some propylene glycol to keep the freezing down a little bit, so it doesn't freeze at 32. So, again, just keep it above that freezing point, you're fine. You're fine. It can
I
get
did-
cold, but it'll quickly get to the temperature of whatever wood you're gluing.
I did find a cure for that. I retired.
So, yeah, we'll hopefully all get there, right? We'll all get there.
So I used to use an old mini fridge that was broken, put a light bulb in it, a
Yep.
60-watt light bulb. I've still got it, I put welding rod in it now.
Yeah.
Humidity, but before I had a heated shop, that's what I kept my.
Yep. So just keep it above freezing, usually you're gonna be fine. Any other questions? And thank you very much. Everybody stayed awake, woo. I do have some Type Bond certified pins for you guys for your job. Let me know if you need any more of those for putting up with me. Is that good?
All right, so we're after 7:30. Like I said, if you need a name tag or you want to know the balance of the account, talk to Steve before you leave. And I don't think they close until 8 nowadays, so if you want to mull around and talk for a little bit before you take off, feel free. Any questions for me? Next month's meeting, I should have looked at the date before I walked up here, sorry.
Fourth in the bin.
The 4th? It's going to be
How
a
do you spell
Tuesday.
your last name, Mr. Hank?
So it's the 3rd.
DEH.
May the 3rd. I will not be here,
What?
but Curtis will be
E
here
as
in
in
my
Edward?
place next month.
D as in boy, E as in Edward, H as in Henry,
Today's April.
N as in Nancy, K as in Keith, E as in Edward. And it's pronounced Key as the bank. It's in German.
Alright, idiot, stop streaming.